So the dialectic involves these three moments: the thesis, its antithesis, and then this synthesis that results from their conflict. It's very important to realize that for Hegel, conflict makes the world go round. Conflict makes the world go round. Remember, for Rousseau, what was really real was the state of nature, was some point in the past where humans were authentically human. And for Rousseau, that's the standard that he can use to imagine our degradation over time, that we build up inequality, we build up a taste for luxury, we build up vanity and envy. All of these things are corruption because it doesn't have to go that way for Rousseau. And Rousseau's thinking actually gives rise to lots of other artists and philosophers in Romanticism who, unlike Rousseau, say we need to go back. You know, they imagine going backwards to this innocent state, a state prior to conflict. In Hegel, conflict goes all the way down. And we'll see that in Marx too. Conflict makes the world go round. The link between the ideal and the real, the link between the noumenal and the phenomenal, the link between what's false and what's ultimately true is history for Hegel. History is that link. History is reasonable. That is the key. That's the Hegelian tradition. That, and it's not just in the end of days that the Christian tradition would say, in the end of days, right, it all will be true. Right? There's redemption and forgiveness in the end of days in the Christian tradition. But that happens is almost it's miraculous salvation, right? Salvation through love or through grace and mercy. In this tradition, the Hegelian tradition, building on the Christian tradition to be sure, it is a process. Salvation occurs because history is rational. We're going to build the perfect society. And that's a hard idea for many people to swallow because history is filled with so much suffering. I mean, that's what really is quite amazing about Hegel. I mean, he tries to give an account of all historical struggle so that it's justified. It makes sense. It is reason itself. And he's deeply influenced by Christianity and Christian mysticism of the Reformation time. And shortly afterwards, because for Hegel, Christianity prefigures his own insight into philosophy. That is, in Christianity, God sends his only Son to the world to redeem their sins. The truth, Logos, the truth, God, comes to the world and is incarnated in the world. That's what Hegel takes as a lesson of Christianity, that truth is incarnated in the world, in the flesh. And for Hegel, it says, that means the truth is in the flesh of history. So he takes it from being the flesh of Jesus to being the stuff of history. That's the only realm where truth is found. And that actually gives politics and historical struggle a much more important value than they would have otherwise had. You can't say, go off and isolate yourself and contemplate and think you can find the truth somewhere away from the noise of the street. The truth is in the street. The truth is on the battlefield. The truth is in politics. The truth will emerge in history. That is Hegel's strong belief, and it emerges dialectically. That is through this conflict, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which he thinks is not just a way of looking at the world. It's not just a way of looking at the world. It's how the world works itself. So here's another quotation from Hegel's philosophy of history. The history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom. And you can hear the optimism of the revolutionary period. The history of the world is none other than progress in the consciousness of freedom. A progress whose development, according to the necessity of its nature, it's our business, Hegel writes, to investigate. So Hegel says, I am investigating progress. And progress is this advance in the consciousness of freedom. And that means for Hegel that the truth is that all must be free, not just some people, not just the best people, not just the elite, but freedom has to spread through all of society. And that is the truth of history. Now, I want to go back to dialectic and make sure that we understand this notion of one thing calling forth its opposite, and then their conflict giving rise to some kind of synthesis. I'll give you first a Hegelian category. Medieval communalism, or feudalism, if you will, where you have everybody in this very generalized version, everybody is in an organic relationship. They depend on each other. The whole gives meaning to its parts. That's the thesis. It gives rise to its opposite, Hegel says, individualistic capitalism, where everybody's on their own. Everybody's on their own. Everybody is fighting for their individual salvation, their individual success, and there's no community. Hegel says those two things are in conflict, and they give rise to another kind of mitigated individualism, where you have both freedom of the individual and some communal interconnection. Give you another kind of Hegelian example. On the one hand, you have infinite God. God is omniscient, omnipotent, all the power. It gives rise to its opposite, the sense that the human beings have sometimes, that I am nothing, I can't do anything. And then that conflict, infinite God, the human being as impoverished as nothing, that conflict gives rise to a human who incarnates the divine. It gives rise to Christianity, gives rise to Jesus as a merely human. I am a person, I am man, but who incarnates the divine. You have monarchical absolutism, gives rise to revolutionary anarchism, and then somehow they combine in a synthesis of ordered freedom. And that would be another example. You can have fun with this. I have the slide there where you can fill in the blanks. You have Charlie Chaplin as your thesis. It gives rise to his antithesis. Let's say Groucho Marx, extraordinary verbal comedy. And then what's the synthesis of Charlie Chaplin and Groucho Marx? Maybe it's Woody Allen, or maybe you have some other idea. You can do this. You can start thinking dialectically by saying, okay, here's the one thing I wanted when I was 15, and then when I was 28, I thought, I want just the opposite. And how does that come out later on in your life? How does that produce? It's not so much a compromise, but the residue of the conflict between those two positions. And you'll see some examples of that on this slide, which I call Rorty on thinking dialectically, because Richard Rorty, great American philosopher, was my teacher when I was a graduate student at Princeton. He used to hand us a sheet like this with different ways of thinking about how opposites call for one another and how one can imagine a synthesis of that conflict. So now we finally get to Marx, because this idea of conflict is absolutely central to his thinking about history, about politics, and about change. Now, Marx, if you know one sentence from Marx, it's the history of all hitherto society, existing society, is the history of class struggle. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. So you see, it's all about conflict, thesis giving rise to antithesis. In the section of his work on alienation that we read today, he's trying to use this notion of a dialectic to understand how, through our labor, we actually become more estranged from ourselves. We actually lose ourselves through the work we do, which for Marx is a contradiction. That is something we will have to change. So here's a quotation from Marx. On the basis of political economy itself, he writes, we have shown that the worker sinks to the level of a commodity and becomes indeed the most wretched of commodities, that the wretchedness of the worker is in inverse proportion to the power and magnitude of his production. There's the tension, that the more you produce, the more impoverished you are as a worker. That is Marx's conflict. That is the conflict he's looking at in this text I've asked you to read for this week. How do you if you're working and you're trying to get out of poverty, what do you want to do? You work harder. But for Marx, in this period of capitalism, the harder you work, the more impoverished you become. Because you produce more and more, which will call forth a smaller and smaller price, you'll get paid less and less, and you will feel more and more alienated. You will feel more and more that you have become, as a worker, a commodity, somebody else's tool. And for Marx, that is a symptom of an industrial system that produces wealth for very, very few and produces a sense of alienation, or what he calls self-estrangement in this reading, for many. Here's a quote from, I think it's paragraph 4, on alienation from Marx. The alienation of the worker in his product means not only that his labor becomes an object, an external existence, but that it exists outside him, independently, as something alien to him, and that it becomes a power on its own, confronting him. It means that the life which he has conferred on the object confronts him as something hostile and alien. What does he mean by this? For Marx, it's in some ways pretty simple. Before exploitation, for Marx, when you were working in your own field or at your own workbench, when you make something, you actually learn who you are. Through your work, and this is a Hegelian idea, through your work you see more about yourself. You learn about yourself from the work you do. So if I was making, let's say, this pair of glasses, I've been working on it, getting it right, making sure that the lenses are okay, and I put them on and they work, I think, my goodness, I'm the kind of person who can make these glasses. I've learned about myself, about my capacities, about my limitations, about my ability to work a certain amount of time for something that when I look at it, says, this is mine. I have created this. Marx says what happens in capitalism is when I make something, it's not mine. Somebody else takes it away immediately. I make something, and the more I make, the more it's somebody else's. And so by working, I lose myself. We'll talk about that next time.